CarQuest is an anomaly of a game for me. It's a good game, of course. I love the story. The idea of the game is super novel. The car itself feels great to control, even if it takes a bit to fully get used to it. The level design is super fun, especially when you know it as well as I do and can exploit it enough to make it seem like an entirely different game, but I don't think any of these are why I adore the game the way I do. It took me a long time to put my finger on it, and I want to take you, dear viewer, on this journey of discovery with me. My very first thought was the ethos around the game. It's really what comes to mind when I first think of CarQuest, just because it's so unique that it's entirely unique to the game. It starts off as a whimsical adventure game. You're placed directly into this holographic tech land that may or may not be real according to the game's story, by an extremely forgetful character who at first believes they're the king, only to be tricked into thinking they're the caretaker of this place, only to eventually realize, through many jokes, puns, and tedious interruptions, that they are in fact Lord Blockstar, the king of this land. His memory was wiped because of the actions of the evil Captain Brick Bristle, who had been sealed within the memory of a history book due to his previous, also evil, actions. He was eventually able to escape by feeding off the latent energy of the Power Realm, storing up enough energy to cause an EMP, and escape the book, destroying Blocktaria to pieces. This is where you come in. Lord Blockstar is teleported to your realm, sees you spinning on top of a plinth, and thinking you're up there because you're a hero or something similar, brings you to his world to piece everything back together. Each artifact restores Blocktaria itself a little bit, as well as restoring Lord Blockstar's memory, as the artifacts all hold a little bit of data about Blocktaria, being a sort of failsafe in case this exact scenario happens. The story is nonsensical, but it's silly and fun, and this vibe is held throughout the entire game, thanks almost entirely to Lord Blockstar's constant interruptions and the low-poly abstract art style of the game. As I played it more and more though, eventually totaling around 250 hours in the game at this point, something changed about the atmosphere and ethos. It became abstract and novel in a way that I can't really describe via comparison. There are amalgamated abstractions of real-life locations, castles, forests, beaches, arenas, pastures, and they don't make sense at all. There's a sand castle that's the size of an actual castle, but instead of having rooms and doors and windows, it's just a square with a single turret and a single cannon, like someone had a vague idea of what a castle was supposed to be, heard sandcastle, and just kinda went with it. The same thing goes for the entirety of the hub. Someone had an idea of what a city was, a large collection of houses and other buildings, but didn't know why it existed the way it did, so they just created an abstract version of one. I mentioned all this in the Ezone Discord server when I thought it all up, and said, it's like some weird amalgamation of people's memories viewed through the lens of a being that doesn't understand how the spaces actually connect. Because of this, I was recommended specifically Psychonauts by Tommy Shadow. It kinda sounds like you're describing Psychonauts, although that game is much more upfront and meta about that premise. I tried Psychonauts. I was able to play it for free because I have Xbox Game Pass for PC, but while fun, it just didn't hold the same level of abstraction, which made it fumble in a way that I couldn't really put my finger on at the time. CarQuest is also very much a video game. I don't mean that it's literally a video game, that much is obvious, but instead that it embraces the fact that it's a video game. It doesn't shy away from its premise, nor its standing in the real world. The game's setting is literally an unnatural tech world created out of nothing but code and holograms. It's not trying to be immersive, it's not trying to convince me that it's something that could literally happen or anything, it just presents itself as a fun scenario, and ironically this makes it far more immersive to me. There are no high-res pictures used as textures, no facade being put on, it's just shapes put together in an abstract representation of something you can relate to. The only other game I can think of that seems similar to me in these two ways was Jet Island VR, a game where you explore a low-poly island on a hoverboard with jet gauntlets and Spider-Man-esque grappling ability. There's nothing realistic about this, and the main goal of the game is to take out massive beasts of metal and code. The feeling I get from the game is different enough though, and I assumed it was down to just being a little more realistic, using greens and browns rather than saturated purples and oranges. It wasn't distinctly artificial. Tommy Shadow, given this information, recommended another game, The Desolate Hope, one of Scott Cawthon's earlier games. Also comes to mind as a proudly video game with strange locations. Unfortunately, I'm not really a fan of the gameplay itself, too grindy towards the end, and the bosses will take multiple tries to defeat. The Desolate Hope is similar to the feeling once again, but still different in a way that I couldn't put my finger on. I see what you mean with The Desolate Hope. It's very gamey, with simulation, synth music, and a cool atmosphere, though that's a little tainted because Scott Cawthon is, well, Scott Cawthon. It's a similar vibe, but it's definitely not the same. Pretty similar to Jet Island, actually. At this point, I had nothing else to go off of, so I just kinda left it in the back of my mind and went on with my life, hoping for a glimpse of something that might give me a similar feeling, or at least a hint as to why the game feels so unique and engaging to my mind. Then, 2.5 weeks later, something hit me out of nowhere. I was watching video essays about video games, as one does, and an episode of Remake or Rebreak by Exoparadigm Gamer came on. This specific episode was about Spyro Year of the Dragon, the PlayStation 1 version and its reignited trilogy counterpart. Suddenly it hit all at once. I love the original Spyro trilogy for the exact same reason I love CarQuest. I love Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Dark Souls, and even SpongeBob SquarePants and Battle for Bikini Bottom for all the same reasons. I know Dark Souls comparisons are getting out of hand, but this seems ridiculous obvious, no? I guess I have some explaining to do. They all have a palpable sense of exploration that isn't diminished by the knowledge that the game world was designed, nor by the knowledge of what's around the next corner. Breath of the Wild, Elden Ring, Phoenix Rising, they're great games with fun exploration elements that don't hold up nearly as much in a second playthrough. Everything feels designed in a way that's trying to imitate reality, or at least the natural, which doesn't hold up once you have the knowledge of what's around the next corner. The illusion doesn't break down in the other games I mentioned because there's no illusion. I'll break this down game by game. Super Mario 64 is the easiest to explain, I think. The castle is far bigger on the inside than the outside, the pyramid is bigger on the inside, even the volcano is bigger. Sure, 2 of those go underground and you can only see the top, but the ceiling of either is far bigger when you're on the inside. The architecture in Wet Dry World makes no sense, especially downtown. The only way to reach the secluded area is via launching out of a cannon into a gated-off area and swimming a distance much farther than any real person ever could, only to reach non-functional doors, windows, and set pieces. The architecture is entirely nonsensical, the painting worlds are an abstract representation of real-life areas, once again exemplified by Wet Dry World with its background being a picture of a real-world location, warped and edited to look like it's underwater and much bigger than it really is. The castle itself is fascinating, with secrets and locations that seem so obscure as to be downright absurd to find naturally. One stained glass window of 3 identical looking ones could be jumped through, one wall at the end of a hallway, a mirror that doesn't reflect reality, even standing in a specific spot and looking at the ceiling. The sense of exploration is upheld despite knowing everything about the game because of the movement in this case, though most people are fascinated without it, evidenced by the iceberg craze popularized by Mishkaz. There are countless ways to just scale the mountain on Baba Battlefield. You can wall jump off the invisible wall at the edge of the stage, teleport via a secret in the wall where the rolling balls come from, shoot out of a cannon, use a wing cap. All of this variety keeps the sense of exploration fresh in my mind even after playing through the entire game dozens of times. The game even heavily incentivizes learning this movement extremely well, while asking you to replay parts of the stage several times to get all the stars in a level, especially considering the 100 coin stars. Ordinarily, Ocarina of Time is a linear, relatively simple, relatively concrete exploration game that holds nothing beyond what it wears on its sleeve. That is until you begin to use glitches. Initially, I was enraptured by the intrigue surrounding this game and things like the Unicorn Fountain, Light Tunic, Dark Gauntlet, Sky Temple, and even the shark in the lake laboratory. Glitches allowed me to experience some of the wonder that these things gave me. Leaving the forest early, clipping through the Door of Time, using tiny ledges you're not supposed to stand on to get through areas quicker, or using a tiny glitch jump to just barely reach ledges you're not supposed to, even if there's an easier way to get there. If you know what you're doing, you can ostensibly turn the game into a sandbox. You can play the Forest Temple as your first dungeon, or get the Ocarina of Time before the Fairy Ocarina. You can explore things in a way you're not supposed to, which keeps the sense of exploration alive. No one was intended to do these things, the developer didn't curate these experiences for you, just like the specific movement strings in Super Mario 64, which makes them seem so much more real, so much more interesting, and much more fun, in my opinion. Dark Souls holds the same sense of exploration despite being deliberately open to being explored in many different ways. Regardless, the game is still ostensibly a sandbox, but only when you know what you're doing. Games that are intentionally a sandbox don't create the same vibe, as fun as Minecraft is. I've spent hundreds of hours playing Minecraft, and while nothing is specifically curated in that game, nowhere feels like you're not supposed to be there. In Dark Souls, it does feel like there's an intended route, namely Taurus Demon, Gargoyles, Capra Demon, Gaping Dragon, Quelaag, Iron Golem, Ornstein and Smough, then through to the Four Lords. There are glitches you can use to fight the Iron Golem as your first boss, past the Asylum, but even without any glitches, you can still fight the Gargoyles, Quelaag, or even the Capra Demon first. If you really want to, you can fight one of the Four Lords, the Four Kings, as your second boss if you just go to the Darkroot Garden first. None of these routes are curated, created specifically for the player to be guided down. Instead, FromSoft created an intricate world with many interconnected paths and locations, and lets you decide where to go and how to get through, which manages to preserve the sense of discovery and exploration, especially when you find a new path through the world. SpongeBob SquarePants and Battle for Bikini Bottom has a different way of creating this feeling, but still creates the same vibe, hence the seemingly egregious Dark Souls comparisons. Nothing in normal gameplay really evokes the vibe, but as soon as you start using glitches, it's pretty heavy-handed. If you stand out of bounds to the left of a taxi platform and mash the interact button as you're being dragged away, then do the same thing again, you'll enter a glitch state where you can somewhat freely explore out of bounds. There are several places you can get out of bounds with no risk of being grabbed, such as in Jellyfish Fields, downtown Bikini Bottom, specifically in the rooftop section of Sandy, and even the Rock Bottom Pit in the hub world of Bikini Bottom. Most locations, specifically not the Rock Bottom Pit, allow you to explore background elements that you weren't really meant to see up close. They're facades of locations you can go to, but are not the locations themselves. A great example of this is the view of Goo Lagoon from the rooftops. There's a giant sandcastle with the ocean in the distance, but if you actually approach it, you see that the castle is tiny, it's only visible from one side, and the water is simply a plane with a texture. Figuring this out for the first time is such an exciting thing, especially for an autistic child who isn't immersed easily but loves knowing how things work. That made these worlds feel so much more immersive because I could recognize the fact that they were indeed fake, but treat them more as if they were real because I no longer was being lied to about their nature. Spyro is what really ignited this epiphany, and it's the thing that I have the most to say about by far. Spyro the Dragon, the first game in the trilogy, is the least of these in this regard, but it certainly has instances of this feeling. The simplest is the large open areas on top of some levels, like Clifftown and Stone Hill. The magic barriers at the edge of the level are the only thing impeding you from exploring the outer world, leaving the area you can explore feeling so much more isolated and artificial. But with the game's fantasy aesthetic, that makes it much more immersive and believable. There are also a few ways to get out of bounds, such as gliding along a wall in Dark Hollow to get on top of the level, or using a glitch where you can die and activate a dragon at the same time in Town Square, which lets you glide along the water without dying. You can even get behind the magic barriers in some instances, which strengthens the feeling that the barriers themselves give, since most of the terrain outside of the barriers doesn't have collision. Spyro 3 has fewer instances of such phenomena, but it does have a couple. You can swim in the air in Sunrise Spring and Evening Lake using various glitches, and jump up to the background elements in Midnight Mountain using some precise platforming or proxy jumps. Spyro 2, however, has many possibilities when it comes to exploring things you're not supposed to, collapsing the illusion of a cohesive natural world, but also breaking out of the confined path that the developers intended. Both of these are what give it such a powerful presence in my mind, even if it's just delegated to the inner reaches that only appear when they're called on. Before I explain what that means though, I'll go over some examples. Glimmer, the very first level, has several instances of this. You can use the ledge just behind where you start to jump onto a crystal meant as background scenery, then use that to reach the upper bounds of the level. There are raised platforms in the bigger central area that you can use to get up here as well. You can use a crystal in the cave to jump up to a flight power-up, which you're not supposed to reach until after you obtain the climb ability from the second homeworld, and yet the first level still hasn't even been left. In the big open area behind the end of the level, there's a big crystal in the middle that you can get on top of, made even cooler if you collect the orb here first. I won't be going over the whole game in such excruciating detail, but I did want to express how ubiquitous this is, even in the very first level. The first homeworld, Summer Forest, is where you unlock the swimming ability, which also means you're able to exploit it and swim in the air here. There are several places you can do this here, the easiest being in the area where Glimmer dumps you out into. You can even just close a door on yourself and jump out of bounds. My favorite location to break as a kid was always Colossus, one of the levels in the first hub world. The main reason is the out-of-bounds room the hockey players come out of, but I suspect it not being super easy to get in there is another big reason. You can't just do a couple of jumps and be there, you have to jump on specific parts of the terrain or you'll slide off, as getting here was never intended in the first place. I also spent a lot of time in the final homeworld, Winter Tundra, as there are places you can get out of bounds to explore, like under some ice, places to swim in the air, and even a portal you can enter early, namely the final special stage called Dragon Shores. I always loved going to Dragon Shores before the final boss so I could use the Super Flame power-up and win with essentially no effort, especially after struggling so much my first time fighting him as a child with small, uncoordinated hands. I'd even spend hours searching for a way out of bounds in the second homeworld, Autumn Plains, because of how easy it is in Winter Tundra and Summer Forest. There is a way out of bounds, but unfortunately I never found it on my own. Exploring these areas, especially when they were completely devoid of enemies and collectibles, created such a different atmosphere in my mind than how it feels to casually play through them. On top of the ethereal atmospheric synth music in the homeworlds, the immersion was completely broken, only to give way to some kind of immersion that can't be found in a completely coherent, normally realistic game world. The ability to exploit and abuse the fact that it is indeed a video game adds so much to how it feels. The intended locations you were meant to explore didn't exactly hold up reality either, the castle in Summer Forest only being accessible via the aqueduct, or the arena where Ripto resides opening with a long hallway leading to the center of the circle despite it just not being there in the actual fight. All this to say that CarQuest gives me the exact same feelings as all these other games. It's the perfect distillation of what I adored in these games, the feelings that made me come back playthrough after playthrough, day after day, year after year. CarQuest plays on my nostalgia in a novel way rather than just pandering. Instead of directly reminding me of experiences I loved, such as Spyro Reignited or Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, it took things I had never consciously noticed and put them out in the open for me to revel in, something no game has ever done, nor has even attempted to do. The abstraction was a direct result of the artistic direction that Jamie decided to go with, whether it be a result of the way the levels were built, in this case Unity Pro Builder, or a direct intentional design decision by him. It still hits the mark perfectly. The castles aren't castles, they're big hollow boxes that have the facade of a castle. The houses aren't even hollow, they're just meant to look like big buildings. There's nothing here to make you think you're actually exploring a massive city, simply the evocation of the aura surrounding such an environment, which perfectly sidesteps the pitfalls of attempting a realistic location in a video game made evident in recent memory by games like Cyberpunk 2077. I don't believe the exploration that I personally take part in was fully intentional, writing up walls and exploiting the design of levels to completely break the sequence of the game, but it was embraced by the first update of the game, adding batteries to areas that were previously considered out of bounds, and further expanded on in the deluxe PC port with tokens placed in even more obscure areas that unlock cars with abilities that make this aspect even easier to experience. I commend E-Zone for such a unique and intensely emotional experience despite the fact that this isn't the context you'd generally use those terms in. Even if this was all entirely unintentional or just a fluke, I was still given the opportunity to experience something so personal to me that didn't click for years, and finally understanding why I love this game so much is such a gratifying experience to me. So thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I have been working on this sort of thing for a while, this specific video. It took me so long to finally understand what made this game tick for me, right? I'm working on a much bigger video about CarQuest. It'll be a sort of documentary covering the speedrun history of the game as well as the development history and a little bit more, as much as I could find surrounding the community and everything. So, thank you for watching. I love you all, and I don't know how to end this.